Close your eyes if you wish. Let your breathing settle into a slow, easy rhythm. Tonight, we'll drift softly through time, through fog-veiled streets and echoing stone corridors, back to an England ruled by silks, ceremonies, and shadowed secrets. The Tudor period, stretching from the late 15th to early 17th centuries, is often remembered for its dramatic monarchs: Henry VIII with his many wives, Elizabeth I with her flame-red hair and unshakable gaze. But beneath the dazzling luster of royalty lived countless others, men and women, whose names were not destined for gilded pages or marble statues. Among them, one occupation stood apart, not for its prestige, nor even its danger, but for the uncanny pattern of misfortune that seemed to cling to its title like mist to a graveyard wall. Tonight, we explore the life and lore surrounding the most cursed job in Tudor England, the Groom of the Stool. Not a title that evokes immediate grandeur, and yet its occupant sat closer to power than nearly anyone else at court. Closer, in ways both literal and metaphorical. Let us begin not in the throne room, but in the most private chamber of all. Imagine yourself, wrapped in thick woolen garments, moving quietly through the stone corridors of Hampton Court Palace in the year 1540. Candles flicker along the high walls, casting gentle shadows that dance across tapestries of hunts, saints, and ancient genealogies. The air smells faintly of beeswax and rushes. It is still early, just past the 5th hour, when most of the court still dozes behind heavy velvet drapes. But not you. You are a servant. More than that, you are the Groom of the Stool, and it is your sacred task to attend to the monarch's most personal needs. The room you now enter is small, panelled in dark wood, warm with the lingering heat of brickwork beneath. At the centre is a chair unremarkable to look at, and yet unlike any other in the palace. This is the royal close stool, a finely crafted wooden commode, lined with pewter and cushioned in velvet. Beneath it, a bowl. Nearby, cloths of linen and a basin of rose-scented water. Your tools. The king, perhaps Henry VIII himself, enters shortly after. His robes are heavy, his movements slow with age and gout. You bow low, then offer your arm. He leans on you, and with practiced discretion, you assist him into position. The room is silent, save for the creak of the stool and the shifting of fabric. This is no moment for jest or revulsion. It is, rather strangely, a moment of trust, for in this vulnerable state, the monarch is defenseless, and so you must be utterly loyal, silent, and dependable. You will hear things in this room that no others will. Secrets, complaints, orders never meant for the council chamber. The Groom of the Stool is not merely a toilet attendant. He is a confidant, a gatekeeper, a shadow counselor to the king. Afterwards, when the bowl is cleaned and the linens replaced, you will stay close to your sovereign throughout the day, helping him dress, managing his private finances, filtering access from those who seek his ear. Your role is one of discretion, trust, and peculiar intimacy. And yet, one by one, your predecessors have met unfortunate ends. One, accused of overstepping his bounds, was quietly dismissed and never seen again at court. Another fell mysteriously ill after a political disagreement. A third, favoured and confident, was caught up in accusations of treason, a pattern, barely whispered, yet persistent. Those closest to the king rarely remain so for long. Is it superstition, or something more subtle, something embedded in the delicate politics of Tudor power? As you walk again through those corridors, nodding to guards and fellow servants, you might feel the weight of your own position pressing a little heavier. There is privilege here, but there is also peril, for the closer you are to the throne, the easier it is to fall from it. Let us now shift our attention to one of the most notable men to have held this precarious role, Sir Henry Norris, Groom of the Stool to King Henry VIII during the early 1530s. His story, like so many in the Tudor court, began with favour, rose swiftly to intimacy, and ended in shadows. Sir Henry was not born into obscurity. A member of the minor nobility, he had served faithfully in the king's household for many years. His loyalty and quiet competence earned him a place at the king's side first, as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and eventually, the much more intimate position of Groom of the Stool. As Groom, Norris attended not only to the king's private bodily needs, but to his emotional and political confidences. In a world where secrets were as valuable as gold, Henry Norris was one of the few men the king trusted implicitly. Letters and royal documents passed through his hands. He managed the king's private coffers, scheduled his daily activities, and even helped draft certain confidential correspondences. Imagine, for a moment, standing in Norris's boots, richly polished leather, soft with use. The year is 1535. You've just helped the king dress for the day. He is in good spirits. He leans in, murmurs about court gossip, gestures for wine. You share a private smile-loan of those rare expressions of friendship from a man burdened with crowns and tempers. But things are changing. Anne Boleyn, the Queen, is restless. The court buzzes with tension. Henry, increasingly moody and plagued by doubt, begins to listen to whispers that Anne may not be as faithful as she once seemed. And it is here that Sir Henry Norris's life begins to unravel. In May of 1536, Norris was arrested on suspicion of treason and adultery with the Queen. The charges, now widely believed to be fabricated or exaggerated, were based on flimsy evidence and courtly intrigue. But in Tudor England, accusation alone could be as deadly as the crime itself. He was imprisoned in the Tower of Londona, place cold and damp, with stone walls that wept with condensation and echoed with the cries of those who had come before. Despite denying all charges, Norris was tried in a hurried court and found guilty. He was executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of May, his head taken by the blade just days before Anne Boleyn herself met her fate. What had gone wrong? Some say Norris was simply too close to the Queen, too comfortable in the king's inner circle. Others suggest he had become a political liability, too well informed, too influential, and perhaps too sympathetic to Anne's cause. But whatever the reason, his fall was swift and merciless. His death serves as a quiet warning from history. In the Tudor court, the line between favour and fatality was perilously thin. To be Groom of the Stool was to live a life of hidden power, but also of constant risk. Your fortune rose and fell not with your talents, but with the mood of the monarch and the shifting winds of courtly factions. Sir Henry Norris, once the king's closest companion, became one of the many who proved that in Tudor England, the most dangerous place, was often the one right next to the throne. Let your mind now drift to the quiet corners of the Tudor palace. The place is not celebrated in tour guides or embroidered onto royal standards. These were the back corridors, the gently creaking floorboards, the polished brass locks that clicked softly behind tapestries. They formed what was known as the Privy Chamber, the innermost sanctum of the monarch's domestic life. The Privy Chamber was more than a physical space. It was a complex world of coded behaviour, silent hierarchies, and cultural nuance. While grand halls and council chambers echoed with formality and ceremony, this was a realm of whispers and sidelong glances. It was here that the Groom of the Stool held quiet sway. Unlike most roles in the Tudor court, the Groom of the Stool operated in a grey zone of protocol. There was no official manual for how to help the king relieve himself, nor instructions for how to respond when he wept, raged, or confided secrets. And yet, the role was saturated with unspoken expectations, drawn from custom, tone, and carefully calibrated presence. This unique blend of responsibility left its imprint on the very architecture of the period. Archaeologists working at Hampton Court and Whitehall have uncovered subtle signs of how this power dynamic shaped physical space. Secret doors, connecting the royal bedchamber to less conspicuous side rooms. Hidden passages that allowed servants to appear and vanish without disturbing the court's order. In these shadowed corridors, the Groom of the Stool was both servant and sentinel. Yet, there remains mystery in the details. Despite their significance, we know remarkably little about the physical environment of the groom's duties. Historical inventories list the presence of stools padded in crimson velvet and perfumed cloths of Cyprus, but offer no direct descriptions of their daily use. It is almost as if a quiet agreement, spanning centuries, shielded this part of royal life from excessive scrutiny. One stool, believed to be from the reign of Henry VIII, was discovered in fragments during restoration work in the early 20th century. Scholars debated its purpose. Was it ceremonial? Practical? A decoy piece, designed to shield the true seat of power? No definitive answer was found, and the fragments now rest in the shadowed corners of museum archives, labelled simply as lavatory furniture, Tudor period. Even the language surrounding the role is soaked in euphemism. The Latin title used in early records, Dominus Stultorum, might be interpreted either as Lord of the Stool or Lord of Fools, depending on one's tone. Perhaps a subtle jest, buried by scribes, who understood the strange contradictions of court life. Cultural representations of the Groom of the Stool are likewise rare and oblique. He appears occasionally in satirical ballads or bawdy plays, often portrayed with a wink and a nudge. But these portrayals miss the deeper truth. The position was treated, in its time, with an unusual blend of reverence and unease. It was a role that dared not speak its name too plainly, and so a shroud of mystery continues to hang over the Groom of the Stool. In dusty manuscripts, faded portraits, and the quiet passages of crumbling palaces, we catch only glimpses of the person behind the job. But those glimpses suggest a figure who straddled two worlds between the grand stage of royal politics and the private chamber, where power shed its robes and showed its human form. In the ever-turning wheel of Tudor society, hierarchy was not just a matter of lineage, it was a system maintained through ritual, etiquette, and physical proximity to power. To be near the monarch was to bask in the glow of royal favour, but like the sun, too much exposure could burn. The Groom of the Stool sat sometimes quite literally closer to the monarch than nearly any noble, courtier, or statesman, and with that proximity came a strange duality. The role was at once humbling and exalted. To outsiders, it may have appeared almost comic. A nobleman tasked with aiding the king in his most private of functions, a duke or knight bowing at the privy door with perfumed water in hand. But this was not the demeaning work it might seem. In fact, it was one of the few court positions that allowed its holder to bypass layers of bureaucracy and speak directly to the monarch. The Groom of the Stool could whisper in the king's ear while lacing his doublet. He could offer a suggestion as easily as passing a towel. This special access translated into influential, tangible influence. During the reign of Henry VIII, the groom often managed the dry stamp, a wooden facsimile of the king's signature used for validating royal documents when the king was indisposed or disinterested. With this instrument in hand, the groom could, in effect, write royal decrees, provided he did so with care and according to the king's will. As such, grooms of the stool were often men of title and wealth. They were not humble chamberlains, but seasoned courtiers, sometimes even close friends of the monarch. Sir Anthony Denny, groom to Henry VIII in the king's later years, wielded such influence that he controlled access to the king's sickbed and shaped the royal will both figuratively and literally. He was among the few allowed to see the dying monarch in his final days, and some speculate he played a role in smoothing the path for Edward VI's succession. Contrast this with other roles in Tudor, society roles of prestige but not proximity. A noblewoman of the Queen's household might possess elegance and status, yet never gain more than a distant curtsy from the sovereign. A bishop might hold sway over the souls of England, but he would not be summoned to the royal chamber at dawn. The Groom of the Stool, meanwhile, slipped between these realms. His power was quiet, unofficial, and thus it bred both envy and suspicion. This suspicion often took the form of satire or slander. Rumours abounded that the groom had undue influence, that he manipulated the king's moods and policies. One poem, penned anonymously during Edward VI's short reign, referred to the groom as the whisperer behind the throne, a phrase that hinted at both intimacy and subversion. And yet, society rarely condemned the role outright. Instead, it observed it with a peculiar mixture of respect and discomfort. Like a priest who tends to sacred mysteries, or a physician who knows too much of the body's frailty, the Groom of the Stool occupied a space beyond ordinary judgment. He was necessary, powerful, and, some whispered, cursed. For what happens when you know the sovereign too well, when you see the mask slip day after day? Perhaps that knowledge of the monarch not as ruler, but as Manus, the heaviest burden of all. By now, you may sense the pattern. The closer one drew to the Tudor throne, the more fragile that position became. The Groom of the Stool, for all his rare privileges and whispered influence, walked a precarious line. For in the Tudor court, proximity was both a blessing and a blade. While the role carried no official policy-making power, the groom's influence could easily stir suspicion. Rival courtiers watched with narrowed eyes as the groom passed messages, advised in private, or lingered at the monarch's elbow. In a court defined by intrigue and faction, this quiet power could breed resentment. It was often jealousy that sharpened the blade. Consider Sir Michael Stanhope, who served Edward VI, Henry VIII's young son and successor. Stanhope's favour grew rapidly during the boy king's early reign. He was made Groom of the Stool and held various lucrative positions. Yet his rise coincided with that of his brother-in-law, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector and de facto ruler during the king's minority. Together, they were a formidable pair. Too formidable. When Seymour fell from grace, Stanhope fell with him. Accused of plotting against the Regency Council, Stanhope was arrested and later executed in 1552. As always, the exact charges were murky, the trial brief, and the outcome predetermined. The curse, it seemed, had struck again. Even those who survived politically often paid a toll in other ways. Sir Thomas Heneage, who served Elizabeth I as Vice-Chamberlain and Groom of the Stool, navigated court politics with skill, but he found himself isolated in his later years, his fortunes waning as the Queen's favour shifted. Then there is the curious absence of grooms in historical records during certain reigns periods, when the role either went unfilled or was absorbed into less personal duties. These absences speak volumes. It is as if, from time to time, the court itself recoiled from the position, wary of its strange mix of intimacy and influence. And perhaps that is where the curse truly lay, not in ghosts or superstition, but in the impossible tension of the job itself. For how does one serve the most powerful person in the realm while remaining invisible? How does one offer counsel without overstepping? How does one hold a monarch's secrets and live long enough to forget them? Even the crown could not answer. For the grooms of the stool, misstep was inevitable. A careless word, a misjudged favour, a rival's lie, and suddenly, the favour that once opened every door would close them just as swiftly. To be forgotten by history was perhaps a kindness. For those remembered Norris, Stanhope, Denyari remembered not just for what they did, but for how their nearness to power ultimately consumed them. The Tudor court was a world of masks, mirrors, and measured gestures, and in this world, the Groom of the Stool was always too close, too exposed, too easy to blame. In Tudor England, the body was both private and profoundly public. Monarchs were symbols, divine and distant, yet their bodhiastically, aging, wounded, were very human, and in no role was this contradiction more apparent than in that of the Groom of the Stool. At its heart, this was a job of intimate access, physical, constant, and by necessity tactful. In a court governed by layers of protocol and strict separation of the sexes, the Groom of the Stool was one of the very few permitted to cross the threshold of bodily privacy and remain there. What did that mean in a society so rigidly gendered? The early Tudor grooms were always men, attending male monarchs. Their duties involved not only toileting assistants, but dressing, bathing, and at times, caring for the monarch during bouts of illness or physical incapacity. These acts demanded not just proximity, but a kind of cultivated discretioner, willingness to be present, but not present too much, to see without witnessing, to hear without remembering. In this delicate dance, boundaries blurred. The groom occupied a space somewhere between servant and confidant, nurse and advisor. In private, the king might be vulnerable, suffering from gout, an ulcerated leg, or the dull ache of loneliness. It was in these moments that the groom's role shifted from functional to emotional. He might murmur reassurances, offer small comforts, or listen, without comment, as the sovereign aired fears that could not be spoken elsewhere. And yet, this intimacy was not always mutual. The king was still king, a divine figurehead, anointed and set apart. The groom was expected to maintain respect and humility, even as he helped lace hose or clean the royal hands. Any hint of familiarity, any suggestion that the groom knew the monarch as an equal could lead to ruin. This paradox was heightened by the Tudor obsession with image. Monarchs were painted in elaborate poses, robed in silks and dripping with jewels. Their public faces were carefully constructed, symbols of strength and stability, but the Groom of the Stool saw beneath the facade. He saw the corset unfastened, the bandages beneath the sleeve, the sigh of pain hidden from courtiers. And so, his position became a sort of mirror knot, a polished, flattering glass, but one that quietly reflected the humanity behind the crown. Interestingly, When England finally saw a female monarch in Mary I, and later Elizabeth I, the role of the groom of the stool shifted dramatically. Women could not hold the post. Instead, ladies of the bedchamber took over many of its functions, though never with quite the same institutional power or influence. The Queen's body, unlike the King's, was more heavily shielded by custom. Though her attendants were trusted, they rarely gained the political clout that their male counterparts had enjoyed. The role evolved into one of decorum and assistance rather than confidant or fiscal advisor. The shift was subtle, but revealing. It showed how entwined the groom's role had been with not just physical care, but male privilege and royal masculinity. In the end, the groom of the stool stood at the crossroads of gender, service, and secrecy. His role was a study in boundaries those kept, and those crossed in silence. Perhaps that is why the job left such a strange mark on history. It was never just about hygiene. It was about presence, about trust, about seeing a monarch not in glory, but in need. And that, in a world built on illusions of divine strength, may have been the most dangerous truth of all. Now, let us step back from the personal politics and pause for something quieter, something rhythmic. The Tudor court was a world of rituals, each act, carefully measured, from dawn until dusk, from birth until burial. And within this intricate web of ceremonial repetition, the groom of the stool performed duties that, while deeply personal, were no less bound by ritual than a coronation. The royal day began with what was known as the leverth, ceremonial waking and dressing of the monarch. Even this simple act was shaped by protocol. The groom would be among the first to enter the bedchamber, bringing warm water, fresh linens, and news of the previous night's dispatches. The king might still be drowsy, but the ritual would unfold. The basin held just so, the towels arranged according to rank, the order of garments adhered to with near liturgical precision. And then came the visit to the close stool. This too was a ceremony if unspoken, a ritual of privacy, cloaked in velvet and perfumed water, held in the same respectful silence one might find in a chapel. The groom was expected to remain calm, steady, and professional. It was not merely assistance. It was a performance of intimacy under the eye of tradition. Afterward, the stool would be discreetly removed, cleaned by specialized underservants, and reset for the next day. Records show that the stools were sometimes embroidered with the monarch's cipher, and even matched to the palace's seasonal decor. There was nothing accidental about them. They were designed to maintain dignity, even in moments of extreme vulnerability. The groom of the stool was also deeply involved in the king's wardrobe, ensuring his attire was suitable for each occasion: silk for foreign ambassadors, velvet for parliament, mourning black when required. He managed the king's jewels, seals, and often oversaw personal correspondence. His touch extended far beyond the privy. But what makes these rituals truly fascinating is how they blurred the line between the sacred and the mundane. Even the act of using the lavatory became, in its own way, a moment of royal pageantry. The groom's movements opening the chamber door, presenting the towel, closing the screen were practiced with such consistency that they became invisible. Yet they formed the pulse of palace life. For in the Tudor court, everything was performance. Every glance, every bow, every whispered word had consequence. The groom of the stool moved within this system like a ghost, rarely named, rarely praised, but essential to the illusion of monarchical grandeur. These daily acts, repeated over years, became almost meditative, like waves smoothing a stone. The same steps, the same cloth, the same quiet understanding between servant and sovereign. One can imagine, perhaps, the groom stepping softly across the chamber's wooden floor as dawn spills through leaded windows, the hush of morning, the soft rustle of linen, a practiced hand adjusting a royal sleeve, fastening a jeweled belt, placing the crown upon brushed hair. And then, a nod from the king. Day has begun, and with it, the rituals that sustain a kingdom not only of power, but of appearances. As the centuries turned, and the great tapestry of English monarchy unfolded into new reigns, the position of groom of the stool slowly began to fade, not with scandal, nor with ceremony, but with a quiet erosion, like the slow retreat of a tide. By the late 17th century, the role had morphed into something far less personal. No longer attending directly to the monarch's bodily needs, the position evolved into groom of the stool, a gentler-sounding title, now focused on wardrobe, correspondence, and ceremonial presence. The intimacy was gone. What remained was a ghost of the original function, wrapped in silk and shadow. Why did it vanish? In part, it was changing norms. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about privacy, modesty, and decorum. Monarchs, particularly in the Hanoverian and Victorian periods, began to retreat behind stricter social walls. The royal body was no longer to be seen or even imagined in vulnerable states. Sanitation changed. Medical practices shifted, and the growing bureaucratization of court life made such deeply personal roles seem both unnecessary and vaguely improper. The last true echoes of the original role flickered out sometime in the early Georgian period. By then, the idea of a nobleman attending the king in the privy chamber was quietly regarded as undignified, even comic. What had once been a sacred trust became, slowly, an anachronism. And yet, the groom of the stool left behind a curious legacy. In history books, his name appears in footnotes and appendices. In archives, his signature can be found on royal account books and household inventories. In some portraits, he may stand at the edge of the frame, half hidden behind a velvet curtain, rarely the subject, always present. But perhaps the truest legacy is more symbolic. The role reminds us that even the highest kings and queens remain, at their core, human. That beneath robes and crowns, behind oratory and ceremony, there exists a basic truth. All people must eat, dress, sleep, and relieve themselves, even monarchs. And someone must be there to help. That someone quiet, unseen, loyal to a fault was the groom of the stool. In a modern world that often celebrates the visible and the loud, this figure from the past offers a strange, gentle contrast. He held no sword, he commanded no army, yet he walked beside power, and was shaped by it, often tragically. And when he vanished from the palace, no fanfare marked his passing, no monument bears his name. Only the quiet corridors of history remember him. And so, we return gently from the winding corridors of the Tudor court, back through centuries of velvet-draped chambers and candlelit mornings, away from the soft footfalls of servants and the whispered confidences behind gilded doors. The groom of the stool, an unlikely figure, often overlooked, stands as a quiet testament to the paradoxes of power. He was close, yet invisible, powerful, yet disposable, trusted, yet never safe. His job was never about glory. It was about presence, stillness, the willingness to remain near when others looked away. And in that silent companionship, he became both indispensable and deeply vulnerable. History tends to favor kings and queens, battles and treaties, but tucked within its folds are these gentler, stranger stories, those that remind us that history is not just written in blood and crowns, but in cloth and gesture, in the soft echo of routines performed day after day, in the dignity of service, and the danger it quietly carries. Tonight, as you rest in a bed warm and safe, wrapped in the familiar, take comfort in this. No throne, however high, is untouched by the human experience. And even the grandest monarch once relied on the steady hand of someone simply there to help, to witness, and to disappear. Sleep now, if you've not already drifted, and let the forgotten figure in velvet shadows fade gently into dreams.